There is a dress in the Victoria and Albert Museum that designers still cannot fully explain. Madeleine Vionnet made it. Silk satin, cut on the diagonal. No darts, no boning, no seams. It does not hold a woman. It moves with her. Conservators study it the way engineers study a bridge, not with admiration for its beauty, but astonishment at what the structure is doing. Balenciaga called Madeleine Vionnet his master. Dior said no one had ever carried dressmaking further. Yamamoto said he spent his life searching for her shadow. And yet most people standing in front of that dress cannot name who made it. Vionnet created 12,000 garments. She fought the largest counterfeiting operation in fashion history. She turned her own thumbprint into a legal seal because the industry gave her nothing else to work with. She built an atelier of 1,200 people with a clinic, a gymnasium, paid maternity leave, in 1930 when no law required any of it. Then the world moved on. The technique every designer still uses, the one billionaires built luxury empires on, kept circulating without her name. This documentary does not restore the dress. The dress survived. It restores Madeleine Vionnet. She began her apprenticeship as a seamstress at the age of 12. Not because she had discovered a passion. Because her father was a toll collector in Aubervilliers, her mother had already left, and school was no longer an option. Madeleine Vionnet entered the workrooms of Paris not as a student of fashion but as a child who needed to earn. The world of haute couture in 1888 was not built for girls from Aubervilliers. It was built on inherited refinement, on women born into the right houses, trained by the right families, presented at the right moments. Vionnet had none of that foundation. What she developed instead was an understanding of fabric that could not be taught, because no school had articulated it yet. At 18 she married. The marriage was brief and unhappy. She lost her first child. She left her husband. At an age when most women of her background accepted the life available to them, Vionnet made a different decision. She went to London. She found work there as a hospital seamstress, unglamorous, exacting, invisible work. But in a hospital, clothing had a specific obligation. It had to accommodate bodies under stress, bodies that could not bend to the garment's preference, that needed to move without restriction. The experience gave her something no couture house would have, an understanding that a garment's first responsibility was to the body wearing it, not to the eye observing it. She eventually reached Kate Rayleigh, one of London's most respected dressmakers, who dressed members of the English court. There, for the first time, she encountered craftsmanship operating at the level she had suspected was possible, fittings conducted with an exacting standard, work assessed not by speed but by what it actually did to the garment. She learned what it meant to refuse the acceptable solution in favor of the right one. She returned to Paris around 1900. She took a position at Callot Soeurs, four sisters running one of the most celebrated houses in the city, known for their exceptional work with lace and their complex, layered silhouettes. It was in the Callot workrooms that Vionnet first encountered the bias cut, a technique of slicing fabric diagonally against its grain, used for trimmings and colors, but never applied to a full garment. She would later describe what she owed those sisters with the specific gratitude of someone who knows exactly where their education came from. Without the example of the Callot Soeurs, I would have continued to make Fords. It is because of them that I have been able to make Rolls-Royces. After Callot, she moved to Jack Dowsett. Another distinguished house. Another irreconcilable difference. Dowsett believed in ornamentation, in the layered, decorated silhouette that defined the turn of the century, fabric shaped by boning and darts and built-in architecture into an idealized form that the woman inside was expected to inhabit. Vionnet believed in almost none of it. She believed the approach was wrong from the beginning, not the execution. The premise. Fashion had always worked in one direction, from the imagined ideal to the human body, imposing a predetermined shape and expecting conformity. Vionnet saw this as a structural error. A body is not a fixed object. It bends, shifts, breathes, reaches, sits, turns. Any garment built on the assumption of stillness had already failed. In 1912, she opened her own house on the Rue de Rivoli. 35 years old. No aristocratic sponsor, no famous name, no appetite for self-promotion. She had spent 2 decades learning how fabric behaved, and she had one conviction, that the relationship between cloth and body could be something entirely different from what it had been. She did not begin with sketches. She began with cloth. She draped fabric directly onto a small wooden mannequin, roughly half human scale, and worked in 3 dimensions, turning the fabric, watching it fall, understanding what the diagonal grain did under tension, under gravity, under the shifting weight of a moving body. While every other designer in Paris moved from flat drawing to cloth, Vionnet moved from cloth to understanding. The geometry she developed was genuinely complex, squares cut on the grain but positioned on the bias, the diagonal pull generating curves that boning had previously been required to produce. Seam allowances slashed to near invisibility. The cowl neck, the halter, necklines that appeared to have grown from the fabric rather than been constructed into it. Fashion historian Betty Kirk, who produced the most comprehensive scholarly study of Vionnet's work, noted that her dresses could not be understood in stillness. The construction only revealed its logic in motion, calculated to create a specific visual effect when a woman walked, turned, or sat, and to dissolve back into apparent simplicity when she was still. British Vogue named her, in 1925, perhaps the greatest geometrician among all French couturiers. The description was precise. It was also, in a particular way, incomplete. Vionnet was not interested in geometry as an aesthetic. She was interested in it as a solution. She described herself more than once as an enemy of fashion, not as a provocation, but as an accurate statement of her position. Fashion was the machinery of the temporary. What she was building was a principle, that the most sophisticated construction was the one you could not see, that elegance was the intelligent removal of everything unnecessary, that when a woman smiled, her dress should smile with her. These were not fashionable ideas in 1912. They were true ones. She was also, in a way that would only become clear later, building a trap for herself. The most radical aspect of her method was not technical. It was philosophical. She had decided, before she opened her house, that the dress existed to serve the woman, not to advertise the designer's name, not to signal the season's approved silhouette, not to perform luxury for observers. This conviction produced extraordinary work. It also produced a designer who had no interest in making herself memorable, who gave almost no interviews, who cultivated no persona, and who, in an industry increasingly shaped by personality, believed that the work was the only argument that needed to be made. She was right about the work. She was wrong about the argument. And in the Paris of the 1920s, that distinction was about to cost her something she could never fully recover. The House of Vionnet reopened in 1919 after the interruption of the First World War and stepped into a fashion landscape that was beginning, haltingly, unevenly, to change direction. The Edwardian corset was retreating. The generation of women who had worked through the war years, who had moved through the world differently than their mothers had, were arriving at their wardrobes with different expectations. They wanted clothing that acknowledged what a body could do. Vionnet had been waiting for this her entire career. Through the early 1920s, while her contemporaries pursued press coverage and cultivated scandal, she worked. She expanded the bias cut from a trimming technique to the governing architecture of an entire garment. She eliminated darts, replacing the structural work they performed with geometry alone. She introduced the halter neck. She developed the cowl back. She replaced the visible hem stitch with a rolled hem so fine it appeared to dissolve at the fabric's edge. Every innovation she introduced was immediately imitated. The imitation was, in its way, a kind of tribute. It also had consequences she was already beginning to calculate. By 1930, the House of Vionnet had moved to 50 Avenue Montaigne, the center of Paris's most prestigious luxury address. Behind the salon, she built a facility unlike anything else in haute couture: 5 floors, 21 workshops producing gowns, shoes, and accessories. A clinic with a resident doctor and a dentist. A gymnasium. A canteen. Chairs with backrests in the workrooms, at a time when most ateliers kept their seamstresses on backless stools through 12-hour days. She offered paid holidays, maternity leave, daycare. In 1930, when no law required any of it, when no competitor offered any of it, she employed over 1,200 people: seamstresses, embroiderers, fur specialists, lingerie specialists, assistants of every kind, and said nothing publicly about the conditions she had created for them. No press releases. No photographs of the clinic or the gymnasium. She did not speak of herself as a reformer or a progressive employer. She had decided that the people who built beautiful things deserved to work in conditions that acknowledged the value of what they were doing. In this, as in everything else, she was building from principle rather than from precedent. And in this, as in everything else, the principle was right, and the silence around it meant the credit went largely unrecorded. The gowns that left those workrooms dressed the most famous women in the world. Marlene Dietrich wore Vionnet. Greta Garbo wore Vionnet. Katharine Hepburn. Joan Crawford. These were not women who wore anything without calculation. They understood the language of cloth, and they chose Vionnet because Vionnet's gowns did something no other dresses did. They made movement visible. When Dietrich walked in a Vionnet gown, the fabric moved a fraction of a second after she did, then settled into a new configuration, each fold finding its place as though the dress were thinking. When a woman turned, the gown acknowledged it. When she sat, it accommodated her without protest. The effect was structural, the product of hundreds of precise decisions, made in advance, by a woman who understood that the diagonal grain of silk behaves differently under every shifting load. A Vionnet gown on a mannequin was a quiet arrangement of fabric. On a moving body, it became something for which there is still no fully adequate word. Edward Steichen photographed her work for Vogue in 1930, a study of 2 models in Vionnet gowns that fashion historians still reproduce, because it captured something the camera rarely catches: a dress and the body inside it occupying the same moment, neither one accommodating the other, both entirely at ease. Man Ray photographed her work. Cecil Beaton. Horst P. Horst. The most important photographers of the interwar period returned to her designs with a consistency that was its own form of critical judgment. Those gowns rewarded the camera in ways that other couture, however elaborate, however encrusted with handiwork, could not. The bias cut responded to light differently than a straight-grain garment. The fabric moved differently. The woman inside it looked different. Not dressed. Inhabited. These were the most photographed women in the world, wearing the work of a woman who refused to be photographed unless she had to, building the visual record of an era without appearing in it herself. In 1925, Vionnet became the first French couture house to open a New York subsidiary, Madeleine Vionnet Inc., in partnership with the Fifth Avenue retailer Hickson Inc. Her work now crossed the Atlantic under her own name. She had built, from a working-class childhood in Aubervilliers, something with international reach and a client list that included the most photographed women on earth. Cristobal Balenciaga, who would himself become the defining figure of mid-century haute couture, put it without qualification: "Madame Vionnet is my master." This was not flattery or professional courtesy. Academic fashion historians have confirmed that Balenciaga, during his formative years in Spain before his move to Paris, acquired Vionnet pieces specifically to study them, not by sketching, but by disassembly. He took the garments apart, examined the geometry underneath, rebuilt what he found in his own designs. The structural logic she had spent decades developing became part of the foundation on which he constructed his own reputation. She was the source. Her students would become the legends. And she was already losing something she could not get back. Her contemporaries, Chanel, Schiaparelli, understood something Vionnet had neither the instinct nor the appetite to pursue, that in the 20th century, a designer's name was as much a product as her garments. Chanel cultivated scandal and was photographed everywhere. Schiaparelli manufactured controversy with precision. Both understood that the modern press required a personality, a story, a conflict, something to print alongside a picture of the gown. Vionnet gave interviews rarely. When she did, she spoke about fabric. She said publicly that she considered herself an enemy of fashion, and she meant it as a statement of artistic principle. It was also, without her intending it, a description of her relationship with a machinery that would decide whose name survived. The notebooks still exist. They are held at the Musée des Arts Décoratifs in Paris, thousands of pages of documentation that Vionnet began compiling in the early 1920s. Each design numbered, each photographed from 3 angles, front, back, side. Each photograph pressed against an ink pad and stamped with her thumbprint. She did not do this for archival purposes. She did it because she had no other option. Copyright law in the 1920s offered fashion designers almost no protection. The industry operated on unspoken mutual restraint that everyone understood was routinely violated. Buyers attended presentations with trained memories. Sketches crossed borders within days of a show. Within weeks of a Parisian opening, imitations were in American shop windows, sold to women who believed they were purchasing something connected to Parisian craft, while the woman who had created that connection received nothing. Madeleine Vionnet was the most copied designer in Paris, partly because she was the best, and partly because the bias cut, however difficult to execute at her level, was instantly recognizable. A cheap imitation still carried the association with her name. The name was the value. The name was being used without her permission, in volume, at scale, continuously. In 1921, she founded the Association for the Defense of Fine and Applied Arts, one of the first organized anti-piracy campaigns in the history of fashion. She lobbied for legal protection. She documented everything. She turned her own fingerprint into the only authentication standard the industry's legal vacuum left available. Inside her atelier, she went further. Aware that patterns were being smuggled out by hired spies, she reportedly developed the practice of changing colorways on fabrics immediately before a presentation, so that even if the construction had been stolen, the final palette remained unknown until the opening. She introduced new designs in the days just before a showing, compressing the window counterfeiters needed. Contemporary records describe the Vionnet atelier as infested with spies, contraband patterns smuggled out, counterfeit labels obtained separately and stitched into cheap copies. By the end of the 1920s, imitations of her work were being described in trade publications as belonging to the Vionnet School of Design, as though she had founded a movement, rather than had her work systematically taken from her. She fought. She documented. She organized. She pressed her thumbprint into the ink pad tens of thousands of times across the decades of her career, building an archive of provements so meticulous that scholars still draw on it today. The effort was real. The cost was real. And the results were partial. Other houses benefited from the legal frameworks she lobbied to establish. The Chambre syndicale de la Couture Parisienne, the governing body of French haute couture, was itself shaped in part by the anti-piracy arguments Vionnet had been making since the early 1920s. Designers who came after her worked in an industry that was marginally better protected because she had spent a decade demanding it. She received no particular credit for that either. The law moved more slowly than the counterfeiters, and the counterfeiters never stopped. If you have found this documentary worth your time, please consider subscribing to this channel. More names deserve to stand beside the masterpieces they created, and there is more work like this ahead. The Great Depression arrived in Europe just as the legal battle was reaching its limits. The casual extravagance that had sustained the great couture houses contracted sharply. American buyers, among Vionnet's most important clients, returned home in smaller numbers or stopped coming entirely. The New York subsidiary that had marked her international ambition became a financial liability. The fashion houses that fared best through the Depression were those whose names carried meaning independent of their garments, names that generated press coverage, public intrigue, the kind of social story that kept wealthy women interested even when they were spending less. Chanel's name meant Chanel. Schiaparelli's name meant the shock of the modern. Vionet's name meant the work. The work did not generate feuds or scandals or memorable public statements. Vionnet gave almost no interviews, and when she did, she spoke about construction. She described her design philosophy this way: the dress must not hang on the body but follow its lines. It must accompany its wearer, and when a woman smiles, her dress must smile with her. A beautiful statement. The statement of someone who understood clothing completely and celebrity not at all. She continued designing through the 1930s. The quality did not diminish. Some of her most structurally sophisticated pieces date from this period, gowns whose construction fashion historians would later need to reverse engineer from the finished object, working backward from the completed cloth because no pattern documentation had survived. The work itself was still at the highest level, but something had shifted in who could see it. The 1930s fashion press was increasingly interested in personality, in the dramatic narrative around a collection, in the designer as character, in the feuds and friendships and controversies that made for good copy alongside photographs of gowns. Vionnet offered none of this. She designed, she refined, she protected what she could. She ran her atelier with the precision and care she had always applied. And she remained, in the public imagination, a name associated with beautiful dresses, without the personal story that turned a name into a legend. The world she had created for herself was under pressure that no amount of extraordinary work could fully address. In September 1939, Germany invaded Poland. Paris began its particular preparation for disaster. The couture houses made their decisions. Some remained open, some relocated, some closed temporarily with plans to reopen. Madeleine Vionnet closed the doors of 50 Avenue Montaigne and did not go back. She was 63 years old. 1,200 people lost their employment in a single decision. The workshops, the clinic with its resident doctor and dentist, the gymnasium, the canteen, the 21 ateliers she had constructed and filled with specialists she had trained, she locked them. She told the press that she had said everything she had to say. This was not, as it might have appeared from the outside, defeat. It was clarity. The atelier Vionnet had built was not a business that could be paused and restarted when conditions improved. It was a particular world, built on the craftspeople she had trained, the suppliers she had cultivated, the relationships between a community of makers that had taken decades to assemble. She understood that what the war would disrupt could not be resumed in its previous form. The city that would emerge from occupation would not be the city that had sustained what she had built. She had said what she had to say in the language she had always used. She saw no point in continuing in a different one. She retired in 1940. She would live another 35 years. When Christian Dior launched the new look in 1947, the nipped waist, the padded hips, the full structured skirt, the fashion press described it as liberation from wartime austerity. The silhouette was celebrated, photographed, and replicated across the decade. It was also built on precisely the principle Vionnet had spent her career dismantling, that the garment's shape came first, predetermined by construction, and the body inside it was expected to inhabit that shape. The scaffolding, the boning, the padding, the structural underlayers had returned. The garment was once again making its own demands. Dior himself had written, with apparent sincerity, that no one had ever carried the art of dressmaking further than Vionnet. The new look was his most celebrated creation, and its foundational assumptions were the opposite of everything she had built. Fashion has always held contradictions without discomfort. The bias cut retreated into the background. The post-war silhouette had no structural use for it. Vionet's name retreated with it. By the 1950s, the woman Balenciaga called his master, the woman Dior credited with taking dressmaking further than anyone in history, was largely absent from the accounts the fashion industry was writing about itself. Chanel had cultivated a story that could survive her absence. Vionnet had cultivated only the work. And the work, without its creator to explain and defend and claim it, had begun to disappear into the general vocabulary of fashion, used everywhere, credited to no one in particular. She had been too private to build the kind of presence that survives a retirement. She had been too principled to compete in an industry that increasingly rewarded spectacle over craft. And she had been too poorly protected by the law to prevent what happened to the techniques she had developed, absorbed so completely into the language of fashion that the woman who had articulated them became invisible inside her own legacy. The thumbprint was on every label. The industry had simply learned to sell the label without the dress. In 1988, nearly 5 decades after she locked the Avenue Montaigne, a businessman named Guy de Lumen purchased the rights to the Vionnet name and began selling perfume and accessories under it from a boutique on the Place Vendôme. He had not made a single garment. The label passed to his son in the early 2000s. Ready-to-wear collections followed. Creative directors rotated. The brand changed hands twice more, sold in 2012, acquired by a holding company in 2023. Each iteration profited from a name that Madeleine Vionnet had built across 30 years of documented work, in workshops she had constructed, employing craftspeople she had trained and protected, producing garments she had solved from first principles. None of that transferred with the name. This is the specific shape of her erasure. Not malicious. Nobody gathered in a boardroom to decide to forget her. It happened the way most erasures happen, through the ordinary operation of commercial logic in an industry with no structural obligation to carry its own history. The name had value. The name was purchased. The woman who had made the name valuable was not part of the transaction. The work survived. The name survived. The woman did not survive with them. But here is what else survived. The Victoria and Albert Museum holds her gowns. The Musée des Arts Décoratifs in Paris holds those notebooks, thousands of numbered photographs, each pressed with her thumbprint, the archive she built to prove, in the only language the industry respected, that the work was hers. The Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York holds pieces from the 1930s. Fashion students in Tokyo, London, and New York study the construction of her garments with the sustained attention that scholars bring to objects that cannot be fully explained. The first serious retrospective of her work was mounted in Marseille in 1991. A major retrospective followed at the Musée des Arts Décoratifs in Paris in 2009. John Galliano, who had built a significant portion of his career on a revival of her structural principles, sent his entire team of seamstresses at Dior to attend. Not as a courtesy visit. He sent them because he believed they needed to see, in person, what their own craft looked like at its outer limit. Azzedine Alea, whom critics had spent decades describing as the Vionnet of his generation, stood in front of her gowns in that Paris retrospective and said simply, "It's truly beautiful. Each dress is a masterpiece." He was speaking as a craftsman who had spent 40 years trying to reach the level he was looking at. Karl Lagerfeld acknowledged, publicly, that every designer working in the second half of the 20th century, whether they had studied Vionnet consciously or absorbed her influence at a remove, was operating under her. The bias cut, the cowl, the halter, the structural invisibility she had developed, these had become so fundamental to how contemporary clothing was built that the woman who had developed them had become invisible inside her own contribution. The technique was everywhere. Her name was not. Yohji Yamamoto, one of the most celebrated designers of the late 20th century, a man who had built his reputation on exactly the principles Vionnet had established, did not speak of her as a historical figure to be respected. He spoke of her as a presence he was still trying to reach. "I admire her. I have been searching for her shadow all my life. It's tiring." That is not a tribute. That is a confession from someone who understood the full scale of what she had done, and had spent decades coming to terms with the distance between his own work and hers. There is something specific about this kind of influence, the kind that disappears into the foundations rather than remaining visible on the surface. Vionnet was not forgotten the way a lesser designer is forgotten, through the simple failure of the work to endure. Her work endured completely. The techniques she developed became so fundamental to how fashion operated that they were no longer attributed to her at all. They became the medium rather than the message, present in virtually every fluid garment made in the second half of the 20th century, invisible as water in a glass. When a technique becomes universal, it stops belonging to anyone. It becomes the ground beneath the industry rather than a contribution within it. The bias cut belongs to fashion now the way the arch belongs to architecture, so foundational that the name of the person who understood its full potential first has receded behind the thing itself. But foundations have histories. And histories have names. Madeleine Vionnet retired in 1940. The designers who would define the second half of the century built their careers in the decades that followed. Balenciaga, Dior, Halston, Alaya, Yamamoto, Galliano. Each of them studied her work. Each absorbed something from the geometry she had developed, the structural logic she had articulated, the specific relationship between cloth and body she had spent 30 years solving. Each of them became more famous than she was. That is a particular kind of legacy. The kind where the foundation is everywhere, and the name of the person who poured it has been largely forgotten. She lived to 98. She died on March 2, 1975, in Paris, 45 years into a retirement she had never broken. She did not attend the retrospectives. She did not read the tributes. She did not stand in a museum and watch a generation of scholars attempt to reconstruct her geometry from finished cloth. She did not hear Yamamoto describe his search for her shadow, or read the academic papers tracing the structural principles she had developed through the work of every major designer who came after her. She died a private woman, which is what she had always been. In the years that followed, fashion historians began assembling what the industry itself had not bothered to preserve. The notebooks at the Musée des Arts Décoratifs became a primary source. The surviving garments in museum collections became objects of study at a level usually reserved for works of fine art. The academic record of her counterfeiting battles, her labor practices, her anti-piracy campaign, her structural innovations, all of it gradually accumulated into a picture of a woman who had not simply designed beautiful clothes but had tried, with considerable seriousness, to build a better version of the industry she worked in. The picture was accurate. It was also 40 years late. What she had said with her hands. It turned out to be enough to make the entire second half of the century speak in her language. Even when they had forgotten that the language had a name. Return to that gallery at the Victoria and Albert Museum. The dress is still there. The silk satin. The diagonal grain. The folds that settle without instruction, that conservators still study, that students still attempt to reconstruct, that designers still describe as the outer limit of what a human hand can do with fabric. The label inside it reads, Vionnet. Pressed against the label, in ink that has not faded across a century, her thumbprint. She put it there herself, in the 1920s, when she understood that the one thing the industry could not counterfeit, the one mark that could not be smuggled out of an atelier, reproduced in a factory, or stitched into a cheap copy, was the impression of her own body. She was right about the thumbprint. She was right about almost everything. The dress survived. The fingerprint survived. And now, finally, so does the name beside them, restored to the work that never stopped being hers. Madeleine Vionnet. Born June 22, 1876 in Chillers-aux-Bois, France. Died March 2, 1975 in Paris. 12,000 garments. Pioneer of the full-body bias cut. Founder of fashion's first organized anti-piracy campaign. The woman Balenciaga called his master. The woman Dior credited with carrying dressmaking further than anyone before or since. The woman Yamamoto spent his life trying to follow. The woman whose thumbprint is pressed into every label she made, and whose name belongs beside every dress that still moves the way she taught fabric to move.